George, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
I'd like to start by asking you about your first research experiences.
Well, I think the way to handle this is to actually say my first research experience, you might say, were vicarious. It begins in high school. I was a high school student who actually had an interest, a hobby interest in archaeology. And I didn't know what social or cultural anthropology was or what ethnography was, but my sister married a graduate student in anthropology from Yale at a very interesting time in the development of one of the schools of anthropology. And she went off to Malaya at that time in like 1960, 61, to study an Aboriginal people really in the deep jungle, the Samai. And what she produced for us, those of us who remained home, were letters from the field. And so I read her letters during those 2 years with great fascination and interest. And it actually, that was my first experience in the field, through the vicarious experience of learning about these people and learning about what field work was and how you learned about them. It was supplemented with a kind of informal education about who Malinowski was or Samai was, but very high school kind of stuff, but very deep, because I came from a small town and the idea would be, oh, did you want to be doctor, lawyer, corporate executive, I guess, or something like that. So it really did change. In archaeology, I enjoyed, but not with the passion that letters from the field turned me on to. So that's where, okay. So I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and actually its anthropology program was going through a certain kind of transition there. And I actually didn't think it was the place to go as an undergraduate to really get a great education at that time. So I didn't major in anthropology. I did a different kind of major in politics and economics, which was really dealing with, at that time, post-war economics, the economic development, et cetera. But my backbeat, and I let the people in the program know, was always to go on in anthropology. So I wasn't going to use this to go on to be a lawyer, to wind up working for George Bush someday, by the way, who was in my class. But that's what happened to most of the graduates in that program. They didn't go on to be scholars. There were a couple. But my aim, so I had this imaginary of working in anthropology from very on, and the imaginary was not the fascination with the primitive or the fascination with the object of anthropology, although of course I was interested. It was fascinating, but it wasn't my passion. My passion was the experience of fieldwork itself, the idea that you could immerse yourself in another culture which challenged you personally in various ways, but also showed you just wondrous things about people and ambiguous things and just extraordinarily rich. So I went through Yale, and my intention was always to go on in anthropology, but at which I knew the definition of the anthropologist was one who had, in training, done field work. So more than, I knew that ethnography existed in sociology and some other fields, but it was emblematic and central to the, just like psychoanalysis, central to the making of a Freudian psychiatrist or something like that. Heaven help me with that. I saw it as central to the making of anthropology. So how this goes on as a bit of a story is that I won the Henry Fellowship at Yale, and I went to Cambridge for a year. And the English were known as people who invented a very rigorous form of the ethnographic method after, Malinowski and many prominent people like Edmund Leach, and that they debated their work in terms of fieldwork results. So I had known a little bit of English anthropology, but I read anthropology for a year at Cambridge. But just as anthropology there in its paradigm, its classic function was falling apart. And I sustained my interest in anthropology not because of the dying, the dying ideas of British anthropology, but because of, once again, the intimacy of which you can learn of the intimacy of fieldwork experiences. So, as usual, I was less interested in the results than in the kind of semi-biographical stories of ethnographers. And that's basically continued in England. So while I found the materials I took them in, the history of the institution, which was the history of one field worker after another, was of interest to me. So what happened to me was this was the Vietnam War period, and I could not resist unless I did resist, so I was drafted. And I spent 2 years in the Army, but fortunately I spent them in South Carolina. I was a Jewish chaplain's assistant, an ideal job in the Army, but it allowed me to teach anthropology at the University of South Carolina part-time as an adjunct, even though I had no graduate training or anything. But there was someone there doing very interesting field work, an older anthropologist trained by Melville Herskovits on the Sea Island, Gullah-speaking black people of the Carolinas, an island which became very famous called Daufuskie Island. It's changed a lot since then. And so it was an opportunity, actually, when I was in the Army, to do actual real field work for the first time. And yes, I enjoyed it. It's not a serious thing in my career. I thought maybe I would go on and work in the Caribbean. I mean, not as serious in that I didn't take it up as that's what I did. So, but that was a reinforcing actual experience of the kind of imaginary of field work that I had absorbed. And then when I got out of the Army, I took up where I left off, and rather than deciding to go to the University of Chicago, where there's a very intense kind of tradition of teaching research, I went to Harvard. And Harvard was an interesting choice because it had been organized in early collaborative fieldwork projects, so that if you go to Harvard, you join someone's project, the project in Brazil, the project on the Bushmen, and the project in Chiapas, and there were a couple of others. And they had been usually well-funded 20 projects where the idea was that ethnography was something ongoing and continuous in a framework. So with Chiapas, there was a ranch, and so there was a kind of organization. These were big projects in which the modality of research was ethnography. By the way, Geertz also was a product of Harvard in the time of Talcott Parsons in the Department of Social Relations, where I started. And he himself, all that wonderful work that he did in Indonesia was part of a huge Indonesian project. But he did it quite individually, you know, the anthropologist alone in the field. And as we, not getting too far off, the famous Chagnon work among the Yanomamo, which became iconic in the teaching of anthropology and very controversial, and the great films by Timothy Ash, where the lone anthropologist walks out of the jungle and lives with these people, and of course there's the photographer. But of course he was the anthropologist on a University of Michigan sponsored medical project, and this was all played out at the turn of the century in a huge controversy. So field work as a kind of landing on the beach, you know, Malinowski landing on the beach, your goods dumped and there you are, is not quite the reality of how ethnography projects actually emerge. They are in some ways separated, distant from life as you know it, but to get to the field, you often negotiate very complex, what not thought of at the time, but were global structures of power and organization. I mean, always. But that was kind of erased from the more pastoral idea of field work, which frankly, if that didn't exist, fieldwork wouldn't have appealed to me at the time. And there was a romantic quality to it, but not overly romantic. I was fundamentally interested in what you could, in this unfamiliar kind of surrounding and the difficulty of translation. All the tropes that in anthropology define the ideology of fieldwork. Making complex relationships with people, which are both friendships and also informant, interviewee relationships. I'd appreciated all that for a long time. Anyhow, I went to Harvard, and perhaps a mistake, because I had thought of locating myself in one of these ongoing projects, so that if I went to Chiapas or Brazil or someplace like that, I would have my own project. I would feel the ethnographic experience of alone among others in community, a form of life which was strange to me, and so forth, which it seems ideologically is the requirement for ethnography and anthropology. But the truth of the matter is there would have been this context of a long relationship of the university or the project to doing these things. So at Harvard, I joined a project by a young German anthropologist, gotten his degree in Berkeley and worked in New Guinea, and who had hopes for succeeding at Harvard. He didn't. Klaus Friedrich Koch, who had started one of these projects in Fiji, and he needed someone, and there were about 4 or 5 people who remain, that do legal anthropology, who are friends of mine to this day, who worked in central Fiji, but he needed someone to work in Tonga. So I went to, I worked in the Kingdom of Tonga, which was not far off, but was something different. And that was my initiation. I worked there for 2 years. I went back once. My early writings are on that. It's a totally, they Christianize, so they're not as exotic as like people in New Guinea, but they have a totally ranked society, and my kind of interest in elites and so forth and so on, you might say was founded there. But I don't know exactly about how much more to say. I was half in and half out. I never bought the, and this relates later to the writing culture thing, as partly methodological, but really a critique of ethnographic representation that emerges from the doing of ethnography. I never quite bought the theories of anthropology. I was exposed to them. You can see the pattern. What really captured me was the idea of doing field work. And I was doing the idea of learning about people through how you could produce field work, and how you produce field work. You know, what notes are, what you do with material after you leave the field. All of the things that you might consider to be methodological questions. and can become very boring methodological questions if they're, because everybody has this experience and that does anthropology, and everybody holds it sacred to themselves. But what they talk about, where the capital of success and promotion and stuff is often in talked about the results. And it so had that anthropology very on, not just after writing culture and reflexive move, et cetera, had probably more tolerance than other disciplines for writing fieldwork experiences into the authoritative accounts that came out of fieldwork. So in anthropology, you could read fieldwork into the literature more easily than other fields. So in sociology, you have some fantastically imaginative methodologists, people whose goal was to really talk about a methodology. Goffman, ethnomethodology, number of other people. In anthropology, the early fieldwork writings were kind of not as good as the letters from the field business. They were kind of self-indulgent. They were basically all the same, although you could be, if they were great writers, you could be moved by them, and there were some great accounts. But it wasn't a serious enterprise. So that's where I end with graduate school. I did like everybody else. I wrote up my tongue and work. I was a Polynesianist. I hung out among Polynesianists, New Guinea. It was a very rich, the other thing about ethnography and anthropology is certain areas of the world. This is not as true anymore because things have really changed after the 80s and 90s, I would say. But anthropology was really dynamic in terms of its area interests. That there was a body of writing at a certain time in which theory and ideas flowered, whereas another area was, stuff was being produced but wasn't as interesting. I would say, others might not agree, that when I came of age, the great material was in the island societies like New Guinea, Melanesia, to some degree Polynesia. Marshall Solms was writing his great work, et cetera, et cetera. The great schools of anthropology had professors who were interested in this. In Latin America, for instance, in that period was, and Africa, which had been so exciting, parts of Indian writing on India. So anthropology is very much like that. Area writing led theory, led the dynamism. So I was very lucky to be able to immerse my area into my specific work in this very rich coming of age. And in those kinds of discussions, everything gets discussed. So the methodological elements that I so cleave to were in there. But then I took my first job at Rice. Should this be a career?
That is fine, although I have one quick question for you.
Yeah, I'll interrupt for a question and say the rest later.
Well, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about it sounds to me like you're saying you produced what amounts to a kind of traditionalist ethnographic account coming out of graduate school, but you had your first experience of fieldwork then. How did that change the way that you thought about the literature that you had read up until that point and the literature that you would produce?
You mean?
The embodied fieldwork experience.
Oh, the fieldwork experience itself totally validated, and I saw all sorts of things in fieldwork that should be written about, that could be discussed, that was kind of missed not totally missed, but was not thought about theoretically or rigorously or conceptually in the remember at this time the burgeoning fieldwork account literature that came later. It was part of the wave of writing culture and reflexivity stuff. That was, so the experience of it totally enriched and deepened, but there was actually no place to write about it. And the kind of account that I wrote was not an account deeply written from the methods. Those remain in my field notebooks, which I've not gone back to and read, but in organizing my library, I've come back and I've looked through my style of taking field notes, and it was kind of amazing because there were kind of field reflections in amongst observations. Anybody's field notes are interesting. I've worked with other, A.M. Hokart, who was a strange character, worked in Fiji, one of the strange marginal characters who was revived as a hero, like Gregory Bateson and so forth. And they always work differently. And except that Navan, in some ways, is a very, by Gregory Bateson, is a very raw book about how you produce an account from what you experienced in the field. Mm-hmm. And at a high intellectual, with high intellectual interest. And I'm not comparing myself to Gregory Bateson, but my field notes were, so my real work was in my field notes. The accounts that I wrote, I'm happy enough with. They were very odd. They didn't follow the emerging Marshall Solon synthesis of Polynesia. And they weren't as good as that either, because Marshall Solons was a true scholar of Polynesian stuff, whereas I really wasn't. I was just writing about some interesting ideas from my fieldwork. But I was successful in that regard. And so I spent the first few years of my real career at Rice writing up this stuff. But I soon moved to studying dynastic elites in the US, and then I saw that what was really required in studying a subject that was located in complex Western society, the kind of society the anthropologist is supposed to study away from, that kind of complexity could never be centered. It could be usefully informed by ethnographic case studies. In fact, sometimes if you were smart enough, you could change policies by powerful ethnographic demonstrations of mythologies that guided policy and other kinds of thinking. And I would say outside its own classic subjects, also within it. But anthropology's great contribution to development, to the West trying to look at the rest, has been to overcome mythological ways of thinking that people think are empirical and so forth and so on. No, I really do believe that. But I saw that opportunity in studying the equivalent of what I was studying in Tonga, and also there was an opportunity, dynastic families of great wealth, and I came to be less interested in family stories and more interested in the wealth itself. So it's early actor network kind of theory stuff, although I had no influence from Latour at all. But that has an interesting trajectory. But the thing to tell you is that I became, as I was developing these kind of research interests, I became more and more intensively interested along the side. This idea of along the side, lateral, is a big, you'll see in my talk, it's a big theme that, but in my development of my career, it had that dimension. I taught a course began to look at ethnographies as end products of what I considered to be ethnographic experiences, and what was relegated to the private archives of field notes and other forms that we don't know about, in which many people produce stuff from thinking and feelings from ethnography. So I taught a course called Classics in Ethnographies with Dick Cushman, who's deceased. And we produced this very straightforward, in an annual review piece that became very influential. It's called Ethnographies as Text. And we were not trained in literary studies or anything, but we, through the use of tropes and metaphors and literary theory was becoming, this was mid-70s, late 70s, early 80s, literary theory was most of the interesting theory in anthropology, or the soft social sciences, non-quantitative social sciences were moving through the theoretical ambitions of literature to become something like cultural theory. And that had a very important influence on providing the kind of intellectual means to sort of articulate some of these interests in methodological interests. So the first kind of take on all this was not methodological. If it were stuck in the realm of methodological, it would be like James Bradley, it would be producing one of these manuals for doing field work or something like that. And there was some good writing of this sort, but it wasn't kind of looking at the stuff we were interested in, which was not just methodology, but, if you want to say, not pretentiously, a more philosophical level of what it takes to produce idea and thought from field work, which has an empirical side, has phenomenological side, and so forth. There were a lot of good theoretical tools at that time that were current in American academia, in that space between, that anthropology occupies between the harder social sciences, farther and further away, and the humanities, closer and closer, because it was coming closer and closer to culture and culture theory. This was early career, late 70s, early 80s. And I had read a lot of this stuff at Harvard, not so much in anthropology courses, but it was in the air. Mm-hmm. I remember, reading, Foucault through other students, mm-hmm. or knowing who Derrida was through other students, not in coursework, nor were they taught in our courses, but there was a tremendous apparatus of ideas and stuff that, if as assimilated in the American context, didn't lead to more philosophical commentary, but led to kind of methodological implication. So I really learned the anthropology I do on the job in my first job at Rice. I hooked up with Jim Clifford again, who was a graduate student at Harvard, who was not a friend, but who was a personality there, I don't mean a big man on campus, but someone who showed up at anthropology a lot and seemed to be doing interesting work, and he was an historian of anthropology, but he was looking exactly, profoundly at the methodological ideas of fieldwork, ethnography, within the culture, professional culture of anthropology. But he was doing it as an historian, as a kind of literary, philosophical historian, in the French context, which was very special, we now know through certain works, which was very exciting. Very exciting. And at Harvard, he wasn't a good friend, but he would show up and give these talks, and they were better than anything anthropologists were giving. Or he would ask questions that were better. Anyhow, I invited him to Rice at one point. He came with a bag of books, and these were books that we had not known, and they were mainly French books. But he was focusing, he had obviously a perspective to think about the production of anthropological work from field work. And so he had showed why it was important to look at text. And Dick and I had already written this ethnographies as text, but Jim was writing it in a very high cultural way. And so this resulted in kind of an alliance. And the very next year, I went to the Institute for Advanced Study. Cliff Geertz was the person in anthropology who was known for writing style, not so much for writing about fieldwork. There are only about 1 or 2 articles, fantastic articles, on his actual experience of field work. But we came to see the whole thing as a bundle. The idea that the method, whatever it was, however it was thought about, what it actually, the artifact for understanding all of this was the ethnographic text. And then you had all of these resources, this powerful revitalization movement in the humanities. So you had all this excitement, and those things came together. So we produced, Jim and I produced, planned, during that year at the Institute for Advanced Study, 1982-83, Writing Culture. And my part in Writing Culture, and it was an idea buried deeply in my thinking earlier, that if you were, particularly in the Dynasty project that I did after Tonga, and also in Tonga, that if you were going to work on contemporary societies, the object of study was dispersed, right? So that this was the origins of the multi-sited idea, and I would say that was the second main idea, and perhaps the major methodological idea, for better or worse, for which I am known. And that article in '95 in the Annual Review of Anthropology has sort of lived on. But what that came out of was the idea, particularly the study of dynastic families, but also a lot of other phenomena, that their agency, their realities were sort of their totality that anthropology tried to grasp as a culture, could never be localized. So if they couldn't be localized, the logic is you had to have a kind of ethnography that was multi-sited. But how could you do this and stay true to the Malinowskian intensity of immersion, et cetera, et cetera? That was the kind of, and I addressed that in the original article, but methodologically, that became a very important trope. So there's a lot to say about it, and where that has evolved.
I'd love to ask you about your "for better or worse" comment.
In what was that tied to?
This article, the multi-sited ethnography article has kind of lived on for better or for worse.
Well, both. I mean, there have been times I've wanted to discuss, well, the same with Writing Culture, I mean, if you do something that has impact, that's it, right? I mean, I don't mean like fame and glory. I mean like when you talk to people and you want to talk to them about something else, they'll always bring it back to something that you've sort of moved on. And even though you're trying to explain it clearly, although maybe that's the problem, the idea, if you have the nerve, is to say, forget about that, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm studying ballet. But I never did that. I continued doing stuff like that. I didn't make a break. So the problem, of course, is that if you think, your developed thinking about it always begins with the first expression. If that first expression has had a variety of different kinds of impact for people. And remember, why does it have impact? Because it spoke to a real problem. But that real problem is thought about, experienced, et cetera, in myriad ways. So that you really, unless it's a long conversation, you're dealing with someone you have a relationship with, you really don't know if you're talking about the same thing, or whether you could ever talk about what it is you want to talk about. Now, in terms of changing anthropology, that's the politics of the field, for which I've paid, I've benefited greatly, but I've paid dearly. There were people who hated that, who thought that it destroyed anthropology, and that eliminated the the topics of anthropology and and there's right now a kind of revitalization movement that focuses around the notion of ontology and the journal How by very bright young anthropologists who, you know, are always going back to Marcel Mauss and The Gift to explain the morality of economics, essentially, which is a very important topic and opportunity, and a variety of other things. But most anthropologists study using, well, here's the point, study an incredible variety of things that, and what keeps them as anthropologists are they more or less are interested in the people as victims, people this. They join with a lot of the other, how the other social sciences evolved. But they've evolved through sustaining this method of fieldwork ethnography. And I think, and there's the it's not a fiction or mythology, but its power is sustained by the continuing production of books that are called ethnographies and that have the general norm. And then we go back to writing culture and the tropes of ethnography that have basically the tropes of the ethnography. I, one point said it was getting a little Baroque, that there's a certain, that the power of theory, of theoretical discussion, feminist, other kinds of theory, kind of has dictated how ethnography should present itself. And sometimes it's going from, you know, it's elaborately reflexive. But I do not agree with pointy-headed empiricists who sort of say, oh, it destroyed anthropology, now it's about you and not about the native. I mean, that was a good joke. But it's a sustained danger. But see, I never felt, I had this great fortune of being in the middle of a movement that has been, for better or worse, or to certain degrees, successful. So I have a look at what's going on in the old social sciences. And sometimes I'm appalled. And other times I see, well, they've done the same thing, but they sustain their own commitments and vocabularies. And you know, I'm looking at things in terms of a kind of moving history, history moving into the future. So I'm very concerned about what the ethnographic case, such as it is and as it's progressed, how it can articulate with the equal progressions of other social sciences and toward science, toward the results of various, the world of natural sciences. I think one way or another the authority of social science work depends upon that relationship to advances now in the natural sciences and how that happens. Sometimes it can happen on the cheap. We are the ethical conscience of you know, of the natural sciences, but anthropologists have it in their idea of how to constitute fieldwork, how to move fieldwork forward from one kind of society to another, back to the idea of working, you know, in Polynesia as opposed to working among rich dynasts in the United States. It involves an adaptation of a commitment to this very same methods that I would like to think still depend upon late at night in the, not the tent, but, you know, under the lamp, writing field notes. But I have to tell you, that's my abiding faith. But I have to tell you that I do not know if anybody does that anymore, including our wonderful and brilliant students. In the current program I'm in, we get extraordinary students, and we far more than we should train. I can go in detail why the University of California wants us to take more graduate students than we So we built the program, but the problem is that even the students, I'm not supervising as many students as I used to, particularly when I was at Rice. Rice became a kind of, for a period of 10 or 15 years, was a kind of label. It was a kind of brand, and it actually produced some fantastic students. And so one of the pleasures of my career is they're out there, they're there to touch, be proud of, have conversations that are not always nostalgic, but I'm fascinated by what they're doing. But that's there. But what I wanted to say about students, I don't, based on my interest in field work, letters from the field, I don't know if those things exist anymore, actually. Why? Because I've been too sensitive to ask, or they've been too evasive to answer, or I don't like the answers I've heard, so I pretend like I didn't hear them. I can't say, but I just have to say that I am. I'll stop, and I'll stop by like where I began. This visceral notion of what you're learning in the field, how those insights become proven, not proven, or refined, is what fieldwork is all about. And I have a fundamental puzzlement, and it could be a generational thing, about really whether or how that is occurring today. Mainly because people are probably using technologies that I am familiar with, but I'm not comfortable with, or something like that. So it kind of drives me toward the argument I will be making in this talk about these parasites, beta, that ethnography is always in beta form, that it's the professional assessment of it is just not in a cheeky way, it's just another site. Because I found this justification for ethnography in a lot of people that I was reading, a student work that I was reading in new ethnographies, it seems like the writer has these larger commitments for which this work is done, and that this is the account for anthropologists. So there's a semi-activist mentality that in the old thing, the be-all and end-all of myself is put into this study of these people to produce this anthropological knowledge. And what you get indications of in the contemporary ethnology is my be-all and end-all and goals are much broader than what I'm putting into this ethnography, but this ethnography gives me the opportunity to deal with these important questions. So the subjects of ethnography have the field of anthropology does not dominate the subjects in terms of which it sends people out to do research. So in the ethnographic writing, you get, in the old reflexivity, it's not the self who's at stake in the field, and that kind of writing still exists, but that was classic of the post-writing culture period. What's more characteristic of what is called reflexive writing now is the system in which I am located in the global world of precarity and crisis, and the part of it that I'm going to tell you in detail, but the backstory is not my total self at stake in being engulfed in a different culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the classic. The backstory has really changed to something like, the global crisis. And this is, and the ethnography is a piece of this. So, given that as a datum, my own feeling, the methodological conclusion that one should draw from that is that it's actually back to a different history of the multi-sited. That the multi-sited should be the basic methodology of ethnography, but not back in '95 when there's skepticism about it because it undermines Malinowskian intensities. It should be, it doesn't do that, but it should be thought through in a variety of different ways. So this is a good time for multi-sited to become something more than multiplication of, going from the rural to the urban, or, although I like, the following metaphor was extremely, worked very well for that, but goes beyond the following metaphor. Anyhow.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
It was a monologue, but...
It was wonderful. It was wonderful.